Let us consciously be imaginary architects. We believe that only a total revolution can guide us in our task. Our fellow citizens, even our colleagues, quite rightly suspect in us the forces of revolution, break up and undermine all former principles. Manure, and we the bud in fresh dung. So said Bruno Taut. And Walter Gropius replied with, "Together, let us desire, conceive, and create the new structure of the future, which will embrace architecture and sculpture and painting in one unity, and which will one day rise towards heaven from the hands of a million workers like the crystal symbol of a new faith." Welcome to the Weimar Spectacle, where I explore the brief and extraordinary life of the Weimar Republic. I'm Bremner, Fletcher, Duthie, singer, actor, and theater maker. I've spent years performing songs in theater from the Weimar period, and I am inspired and, maybe more than a little obsessed by that moment in time. Long live Utopia. So said Bruno Taut, a groundbreaking Weimar architect, and in this episode we'll be taking a look at the utopian architecture of the Weimar Republic. That, despite its utopian yearnings, still managed to navigate the dull, everyday needs of city bureaucracies and the dull, everyday needs and practicalities of the construction work to provide new, modern homes for a people yearning for a whole new way of living. This will be a kind of photography-heavy episode, so I'll be speaking about the hopes and dreams of the architects and designers, but I'll let the buildings speak for themselves. You'll have to go look at them on my website because I'm kind of crap at describing buildings, but they're all there at bremnersings.com, BREMNERSINGS.com. I am squeezing this episode into the middle of a 6,000-mile tour, performing in cities across the USA and Canada, so forgive delays in new episodes. Life on the road is kind of hectic. Okay, my big idea for these podcasts is that the Weimar Republic invented everything about the modern world, and we are all still dealing with the possibilities and problems it gave to us. To prove this possibly completely unprovable idea, I will be exploring the arts, the politics, the science, the architecture, and the social innovations of the Weimar period, and of course, the terrible and irresistible rise of the Nazi Party. So, if you are a low-income housing advocate struggling to get a single building completed in your NIMBY neighborhood, and you're curious about how the Weimar planners got so much done, or maybe you're a new home buyer about to gut that old wreck of a home and start afresh, and you're curious about how Weimar designers made practical, beautiful homes filled with light, then this is the podcast for you. So, in 1918, hundreds of thousands of soldiers are returning from the trenches and from the killing fields of the Great War. They had simply been told to go back to their villages and just restart their pre-war lives. However, they found themselves returning to a revolution in progress, a physical, violent revolution, but also a revolution in culture, social ideals, new technology invented because of the demands of the war, and a revolution in politics, sexuality, and gender. And many of those men chose to make new choices about their lives. Often that choice was to stay in the rapidly growing cities and search for employment in the new industrial economy also now centered around the cities. They recognized correctly that cities would be the place of ambition and possibility in the modern age. However, in those cities, housing was in a complete crisis. Berlin between 1816 and 1910 increased in size by 17 times, from 250,000 to 3.7 million. And in 1918, the homes and the tenements, which held most of that new population, had been built, for the most part, in the mid-1800s, and they were falling into disrepair because of overcrowding and lack of investment from landlords. Americans might be familiar with the shocking yet kind of tragically beautiful pictures that Jacob Riis made in the 1880s of the terrible conditions in the Lower East Side in New York, with immigrant families crammed into the tiny rooms without toilets or proper cooking facilities. They're incredible pictures. Jacob Rees, I'll look him up, and I will put a couple on the website. In Germany, there was a similar expose just slightly later, using photography in a series of surveys of living conditions in the early 1900s. Studies actually commissioned by health insurance companies concerned about the living conditions of their poorer clients. Landlord groups went to court to attempt to suppress the findings in the photographs, but it became evident to all that serious change was needed in the construction in Berlin and the larger cities of Germany. Making matters much, much worse was the fact that all new housing construction had effectively stopped in World War I. Construction laborers had been conscripted into the army. Many had died at the front. In 1914, there were almost 5,000 new buildings completed in Berlin, and in 1918, only 50 were finished. So the new Weimar government made housing a priority. And as with everything with the Weimar government, it was kind of a mix of wild, revolutionary, idealistic beliefs that human beings deserved better conditions than the nightmares of the tenements of Berlin, and also a realization that if they wanted to stay in power, they'd have to provide for their electoral base. And by any measure, they made extraordinary achievements. By the end of the Weimar era, in about 13 years, 2.5 million dwellings had been built in Germany, with most of them having some kind of government funding for their construction. That meant new, modern housing for 9 million people, who for the first time had indoor plumbing, electricity, and gas. Now, those achievements all came along with huge ideological fights about how people should live. Because with those 2.5 million homes, the state was essentially creating a new way of living for its population, a new mold for its working population. Every choice about those new homes was debated, from how to design a kitchen, to how many interior doors a home needed, to what color was morally acceptable on the outside of an apartment. It's easy to be casual about these achievements and debates today when we take toilets and hot water and electric lighting for granted. However, I personally have a clear memory of a time when I lived in an old apartment on the edge of Paris, and at dinner at our home one evening, there were several people I didn't know very well, and I made the mistake of criticizing a huge, looming concrete apartment complex just north of us. Well, it turned out that one of our guests had grown up in that complex, and he did cheerfully agree that they were not the most beautiful building in the world. However, he explained that those homes had changed the lives of his family as they escaped buildings where entire floors of apartments shared the same toilet, and cooking happened on old smoky stoves, and electricity and hot water were either erratic or unknown. Those people had been happy to swap aesthetics for hygiene and less overcrowding, and, if I understood him correctly, for the sense that they were now also included in the modern era. For the Weimar dreamers, however, aesthetics were not just decorative frills. They believed that humanity deserved and needed beauty in and around their homes. They insisted that living in beautiful surroundings would make people better citizens, contribute to the growth of the human spirit. And they insisted that it was time to apply the new scientific principles of the modern era to the home. So they commissioned time and motion studies to make sure that homes were efficient and functional, and they rethought the basics of how buildings were made, so the materials could be mass-produced in factories rather than made by craftsmen on site. The word that ran through all of their designs was organic, which for them meant never giving up on some connection with the natural, both in the building's forms, in the access to nature, and in the way the building would respect human needs and desires. And their guiding slogan for these new homes was Licht, Luft, Sonne, light, air, sun. However, in among these slogans and ideals, the trick was how to balance those big ideas and ideals with actually being able to afford to build homes for 9 million people. So I'm going to take a look at 4 architects and designers. Bruno Taut, who created extraordinary, livable, innovative apartment complexes that you can still visit in Berlin today. Erich Mendelsohn, who created commercial architecture that transformed the way we shop and consume and still influences commercial design. Walter Gropius, whose Bauhaus building was a kind of perfect break with all previous human structures, and whose teachings were perhaps more influential than his buildings, and Margaret Schutt-Lohotzky. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Margaret Schutt-Lohotzky, whose rethinking of interior design, especially kitchen design, transformed the lives of women in the home and still looks like the basis for every single trendy IKEA kitchen ever. And as always, with the Weimar period, maybe the most important thing to remember about them is that they've just gone or experienced the horrors of World War I, either actually in the trenches or as part of the total war effort that had taken over every aspect of German society by the end of the war. And even Margaret Schutt-Lohotzky, who was Austrian, had experienced, at least from a distance, this collapse of society. So let's bring it back to me again. Let's make it about me. I like to walk. My visits to new cities involve long, aimless wandering that usually end with me lying on a hotel bed, wondering why do my feet hurt so much? Despite the pain, I think walking and just getting lost means you stumble on things that you would never find in a tourist guide, especially now, when the tourist industry is the horror show of shallow, rapacious bloggers and AI-generated content, all relentlessly directing us towards nothing but endless opportunities to spend, consume, and click. Sorry, slight rant there, but you know what I mean. So I remember my first visit to Berlin, when in the middle of a day-long walk, I stumbled into one of Bruno Taut's Weimar apartment blocks, Onkel Tom's Siedlung, in the southwest of the city. Modest, often long, lovely apartment blocks of 3 or 4 stories with balconies, recessed windows, exterior walls painted in large blocks of warm pastel colors, sometimes with gently curving lines that follow the movement of the streets, and surrounded by trees and small green spaces. In comparison to the heavy stone architecture of central Berlin, with 4 or 5-story buildings looming over the street with heavy ornamented facades and massive, almost church-like communal doors that throw you right out onto the sidewalk, well, it seemed like I'd walked through a portal into some calm, clean, alternate world. And indeed, a commonality between all the architects and designers that I'm going to mention is something that's almost invisible to our modern eyes, and that's a stunning lack of ornamentation on the exterior. So a complete break with the historical references on almost every other building from earlier times, which are covered in details that often have no function except to reference even older styles, whether it's statues or steeples or peaked roofs. It's a radical break in history, which is difficult to see with our eyes when we're so used to it, but it goes along with the radical changes in politics, society, and culture of the Weimar era. So Bruno Taut. He started his career as a complete idealist. His first sketches of his ideal architecture are huge crystal structures built right on the top of the Alps, looking more than a little like Superman's Arctic lair, and they seem completely mad. But then again, after the horrors of World War I trench warfare, perhaps huge, bright crystal buildings high up on a green mountain might have made a lot of emotional sense. He started a group of equally idealistic artists, designers, and architects who communicated in what they called the crystal chain letters, filled with dreams of idealistic artistic revolution. Wenzel Hablich, a designer, said, I love this quote, "Your ideas should be irresponsibly free as a bird. Let us create a fresh atmosphere, a pure aura of spirit wit and joy. Come and join the struggle against all things negative and corrupting. Join the struggle, preach, rejoice, blow the trumpet, speak out in 100 persuasive tongues. Sacred duties, you must speak out. We should be teaching people how to be happy. Man and woman, girl and child, speak out, speak out. Delight in existence, in the universe, in being and in perishing. We should be expunging the thought of war from the hearts of all mankind. Where are you, prophets, the heralds of a new life, telling of the new sounds, moon and stars? The millions await you. Okay, it's a little over the top, but overall, I think Wenzel would get my vote. Strangely, despite these wild idealistic beginnings, it turns out that Bruno Taut is very, very, very good at bureaucracy. In Berlin, he takes a post that has the very, very, very unglamorous, non-utopian sounding description of, quote, working with a mixed-financed cooperative company with a mission to build low and medium-income housing. And his ability to balance visionary ideas with the practical needs of human beings, the need for social reform, and the ability to make buildings that cities could afford, well, all that adds up to produce some of the most innovative and livable buildings ever made. Two of his best in Berlin are still standing despite the Allied firebombings at the end of the war. There's Onkel Tom's Siedlung in the southwest, which I already mentioned, and there's the Hofeisen, or Horseshoe Building, in the southeast. I'll put pics on the website since, again, I'm not incredibly brilliant at describing architecture, but overall the goal of the two projects was always to provide reasonably sized, sunny homes with close access to nature, with modern appliances to help the work of women in the home, and with a total rethinking of the way a modern family uses a home. So they're intended for a modern working family with only 2 children who, according to the architects anyway, want to live in clean, modern homes without a million knickknacks and paintings and heavy wooden furniture. The Horseshoe Building is just as described, a huge horseshoe-shaped building with the interior apartments staring into a small wooded parkland. It's part of a huge development, all designed by Taut and one other architect, with the priority again being access to green space, schools, medical facilities, common space, and athletic facilities. So that's Bruno. Next, let's chat about the amazing Margaret Schut-Lhotsky, since we're discussing the new living space for the new modern family. Schutz-Lhotsky was born in 1897 near Vienna. She was the first female student at the University of Applied Arts in Vienna, apparently only squeaking in because of a personal letter of recommendation from the painter Gustav Klimt. She decided to study architecture, and she writes, quote, "They thought that I would starve to death. No one could imagine hiring a woman to build a house in 1916, not even myself." She focused on social housing and wrote, quote, "I was convinced that the economic independence and self-realization of women would be a common good, and that therefore the further rationalization of household labor was imperative." Apart from being an incredible badass and a resistance fighter in World War II, she is best known for her work in Frankfurt, where she came up with the so-called Frankfurt Kitchen. The city was dealing with the terrible conditions of the working class life, and visiting the existing homes, Margaret was astounded. She said, "I didn't know yet the great Heinrich Zille quote, 'You can kill a person with an apartment just as well as with an axe,' but I felt it." She also used time and motion studies to come up with a small but practical built-in kitchen that could be mass-produced for working-class apartments. She based her design on a railroad dining car kitchen, using small spaces to their maximum potential, but using mass production to construct attractive, colorful spaces. 10,000 of these kitchens were installed. And if you walk through any IKEA in the world today, you will see that her practical, minimalist, functional, beautiful aesthetic lives on. Although she actually had mixed feelings towards the end of her life. Margaret Schut-Lhotsky said at the age of 101, Quote, "If I had known that everyone would keep talking about nothing else, I would never have built that damn kitchen." And then she insisted, quote, "I am not a kitchen." If you're in Vienna, you can get a feeling for her work from visiting the 592 square foot apartment on Vienna's Franzengasse, in which she lived for the last 30 years of her life. And the MAK, the Museum of Applied Arts, houses a replica of the Frankfurt kitchen. I was performing in Minneapolis a couple weeks ago, and I was amazed to stumble upon another replica of her kitchen in the Art Institute there, and I will put pictures of that on the site. Next, let's touch on Erich Mendelsohn. He also served in the trenches of the front lines during World War I. Afterwards, in an act of hugely ambitious modernist prophecy, he founded his architectural office on November 9th, 1918, the very same day that huge demonstrations were happening across Berlin and the new German Republic was declared. Mendelssohn was another practical idealist who wanted a break with the past, which is one way one could describe so many people in the Weimar Republic. He writes, quote, "It is unthinkable that we can turn back time, unthinkable that we leave unused the greatly broadened possibilities of technology, that we see the machine as the enemy of humanity instead of a powerful tool that we need to master, unthinkable that we base our personal lives on some original and ancient fatherland instead of trusting the keys to modern times, for this modern time is our own time." His most memorable works are the new, huge department stores in large German cities. To be honest, in the first pictures when I was looking at these, I found it difficult to see the innovation of these buildings. And that's simply, again, a measure of how influential they are, since they resemble so much modern construction. It's not till you pull back in the field of focus and see them surrounded by the rest of the old German city, and you see that they actually look like they've been dropped in from an alien civilization. They're such a radical break with the past. Massive, organic, flowing walls of glass and concrete opening in and out from the interior spaces and out into the streets, allowing the human gaze to move in and out, and also for light to flow in during the days and the new electric light to flow out at night. One of his first buildings was the Einstein Tower, a housing for a telescope meant to confirm Einstein's theory of relativity. Mendelssohn wanted to create a structure which would reflect those theories, and he came up with a dynamic, organic structure of a central observatory tower with rings of windows on top of a wave-like platform that housed laboratories. And to create it, he decided to use modern, sculpted, reinforced concrete, which, however, was not actually up to the demands of the building, the technology at the time. So the building was immediately beset by endless structural flaws, and it wasn't until about 1999 that it was finally solid and secure. In my humble opinion, the Einstein Tower was this huge, bold statement of intent and an experiment about how maybe we were all going to live in the modern era, inside wild, expressionistic buildings filled with modern, decorative elements that express our inner needs and wants. Perhaps if it hadn't been so flawed, we'd all now be living in huge, swooping, poetic, deeply meaningful organic structures. However, it was sadly not to be. Functionalism, as represented by the international style, won out, and so essentially we are living in Walter Gropius's world. Walter Gropius is a contradictory and brilliant character, and maybe in the end most influential through his teaching and ideas, and not necessarily just from his finished buildings. And indeed, while Taut and Mendelssohn and Schott Lachocki had huge influences over the modern era, it's not totally wrong to say we live in Gropius's world. He's born in 1883. He trains in the same architecture studio as architects and thinkers Mies van der Rohe and Le Corbusier. His first works are industrial buildings like the Fagus factory, which at the time was praised for its unprecedented sense of openness and continuity between inside and outside. Gropius also served in the trenches of World War I, and immediately after he left the army, he took a position as chairman at the Weimar Academy of Fine Arts, and there he states its mandate as, quote, "Art and the people must form an entity. Art shall no longer be a luxury of the few, but should be enjoyed and experienced by the broad masses. The aim is an alliance of the arts under the wing of great architecture." In 1925, the school moves to Dessau, and there Gropius creates what is perhaps his best work, the Bauhaus Art School building, which is still standing. You can go and see it. And perhaps the most extraordinary feature of the complex, again, kind of hard to see from our modern eyes, but it's the huge glass curtain of the workshop. The support columns of the building were set faced inward to allow an uninterrupted glass facade to stretch all over the 3 floors as well as the entire length of the building, changing the relationship between the inside and outside, giving freedom and clarity, transparency, lightness and flatness, and in one fell swoop, changing all previous ideas of architectural aesthetics with an almost brutalist absence of ornamentation. At the Bauhaus School, no matter what focus they had, in a kind of rebirth of the old craft schools, students studied all disciplines: painting, sculpture, printmaking, architecture, and professors were encouraged to mingle and work side by side with students. Gropius writes, quote, "Art itself cannot be taught, but craftsmanship can. Architects, painters, sculptors are all craftsmen in the original sense of the word." Bauhaus aesthetics endorsed simplicity, honesty, and purity. Ornamentation, grandiose elements, and pointless gesture were discouraged as bourgeois excesses or just plain bad art. Form would follow function. Now, all this sounds amazing, and the buildings are gorgeous, and working within them must have been an extraordinary pleasure especially the industrial buildings, after the dark satanic mills of the Industrial Revolution. And they were well meant. Gropius says, quote, "We want to create the purely organic building, boldly emanating its inner laws, free of untruths or ornamentation." The nagging question for me is, how did those gorgeous, idealistic, socialist buildings transform into the endless lines of featureless glass boxes that today characterize cities around the world? The perfect image of that transformation might be the clean-lined, geometric, Gropius-designed MetLife building that looms over the ornate Beaux-Arts Grand Central Station in New York City. It's the clean new dominating the overblown old. At the time, it must have been a gorgeous revolutionary statement of intent. However, repeated over and over again around the world, I don't have any words for how much I hate those cityscapes. So, in a nutshell, to partly explain his influence, after he flees Germany in 1934, Gropius becomes head of the Harvard School of Architecture, and Mies van der Rohe takes over in Chicago, and they both immediately replace the traditional Beaux-Arts curriculum with their own fundamentals of design, the international style. The international style, as it comes to be known, takes off across America and then the world's urban landscapes, filling street after street with unending boxy buildings composed of steel, concrete, and glass. And sure, there are some gems amongst them, but again, repeated and repeated and repeated. Personally, I think the tendency to blame Gropius or Mies van der Rohe is kind of off the mark and gives them a dictatorial power that they didn't have, although from what I've learned about the vast ego of architects, perhaps they really, really, really wished they had. I'd personally throw the blame on the fact that endless shitty rip-offs of those initial gorgeous buildings with flat roofs, glass facades built of steel frame and concrete with no external ornamentation, produced from stock pieces made in factories, were massively cheaper to build, and capitalism simply swooped in and decided that this was how we were all going to live, and used the theory of the Bauhaus as justification for telling us that we were all old-fashioned if we dared to like older Beaux-Arts design or desire some new version of modern living. Recently, as I was walking through Venice Beach in LA, I was kind of bitterly amused to watch that as the wealthy Google programmers and administrators moved into the area, all the lovely old arts and crafts bungalows are being torn down. And what they're building for themselves are some of the most boring, modernist boxes imaginable, using the worst version of the aesthetics of the international school. Gropius said, quote, "A modern, harmonic, and lively architecture is the visible sign of an authentic democracy." Well, I guess there is something darkly amusing about watching some of the most powerful people in the modern information age barricade themselves into featureless concrete blocks, thinking they are making bold statements about how modern they are. Or maybe I should be more positive and think that however corrupted, what still endures is the socialist myth and aesthetic that Bruno Taut, Margaret Schott-Lahutsky, Erich Mendelsohn, and Walter Gropius came up with in those revolutionary days of the Weimar Republic. All of Weimar's architectural creativity stopped with the rise of the Nazi Party, which is interesting because National Socialism's stated aim was to help the workers of Germany, and Weimar architecture had been incredibly successful in doing that. However, ideology trumped practicality, and no matter how successful the new modern buildings had been in actually giving people a chance to live a modern life, the Nazis were not going to accept those new ideas. Which makes me think, as the whole world right now faces a massive housing shortage, what are we going to build? Will we build practical, lovely new homes that prioritize community and human-centered functionality that help create neighborhoods and allow the inhabitants access to light and sun and green space and give people a sense of self-respect? Or will we build profitable, expensive, identical monstrosities which sell a shallow dream of shining marble countertops, brand new appliances, and high-speed internet to make people forget they are living in a dysfunctional building that, despite floor-to-ceiling windows, are actually designed to separate them from the world, kill communities, and kill connections between people? So once again, if some of the concerns and desires in these stories seem familiar, well, they should, because I believe the Weimar Republic helped give birth to the modern world. Thank you so much for listening. Hit subscribe or follow if you want to know when the next episode appears. I don't have any advertising budget for this show, or really any budget at all. I am just some obsessed cabaret singer repurposing an old microphone. So if you leave a review on your app, or hit the star button, or just share the episode with a friend, well, it really encourages the podcast to grow, and that would be wonderful. I hope you join me in the coming months as I explore more about the strange birth, life, and death of an experiment in creating a new society. And again, I'll put images of the buildings and the cities for this episode onto my website, bremnersings.com, BREMNERSINGS.com. And who am I to discuss Weimar? I am not a sociologist, political scientist, or historian. I am an obsessive artist, a singer, a playwright, a cabaret performer who's been obsessed with the arts and music of the Weimar Republic all my life. I've recorded 3 albums dedicated to the music of this time, and particularly the music of Kurt Weill and Bertolt Brecht. And if you'd like to listen to them, just search for Bremner, Fletcher, Duffy in any music streaming site, and you'll find all my albums. And if you want to know more about my work, see the images from the period, or suggest a specific Weimar subject for an episode, drop by bremnersings.com. Thank you so much, and join me next time for another walk through the amazing, creative madness of 1920s Germany.